All right, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being here for the expert panel on state forest carbon data and modeling. I'm Kylie Clay here with the Forest Carbon and Climate Program out of Michigan State University. I'm one of your three hosts today. So we have myself, the Associate Director of the program, Chad Papa and Daphna Gadot, also part of the FCCP. And so the three of us will be have been working on these resource guides that you've been seeing in your inbox weekly the last few weeks, and we will be collectively trying to host and collect, sort, and so forth questions for this panel. So just a quick background before we get going into today's panel, just a quick background on what this project is, how it started, what its objectives were, and what activities we've undertaken as part of it. So this event is one component of a multi-component project, all under the umbrella of the Forest Carbon Inventory and Modeling Needs Assessment Project. So that with that, this project has all been funded by the U.S. Forest Service Eastern Region, and our project partners on this have been Wilson Engineering Services and the University of Maine. So this project has had, for our component in particular, has had two overarching goals. One, assess the state capacity, interest, needs, and motivations for forest carbon monitoring, modeling, data interpretation, communications, and linkages with policy in the Eastern region in particular. So what are the state level interests, motivations, and barriers regarding carbon modeling? And second, sort of a follow-up to that, is to develop knowledge transfer, state level knowledge transfer materials to address some of those identified gaps. And so our project activities to tackle these projects, if you will, listed on the right here. The first things we did were needs assessment survey, and interviews. A lot of you may have been contacted for those things, and thank you for your time if you were able to do those surveys or those interviews. And so we compiled information there to kind of get the landscape, to understand the landscape of state level capacity, interest, motivation, along a series of dimensions regarding forest carbon modeling. To the second part, developing these knowledge transfer materials, we have two key things here. One are the resource guides that you've been seeing coming out again over the last few weeks, and then this expert panel. So, and they are, linked here. The resource guides have covered a series of different topics related to forest carbon modeling, stemming from FIA data, inventory data, carbon calculations, how to handle uncertainty, best practices for modeling, and then also harvested wood product data, considerations for carbon in harvested wood product, as well as linkages with the policy space, communication, how to think about handling trade-offs between carbon and other policy or state objectives. And so the resource guides have covered the span of topics. We've tried to bring to the table today 5 experts in diverse elements of that space. So hopefully you've had a chance to look at those resource guides and can maybe use this opportunity now with some of the experts in the room to ask any outstanding questions or experience questions, any kind of questions you like that are that you're left with after perusing those resource guides, or just any questions having to do with forest carbon modeling. And then last on the list is a white paper. You'll see that's coming up next, and it will report on the findings primarily from the survey and the interviews. So that's the project. And here we are now at today's expert panel. So note that this is being recorded, so you can revisit. Will be available on our ORL, or our open resource library, alongside the resource guide. So you may have already seen that page. Today's panel session, how we're intending for it to go, it's a long session. So we'll do quick introductions of all of the panelists. In particular, they will talk about so I'll introduce them briefly, and then I'll allow them to speak to their role as it relates to forest carbon modeling, and their experience more specifically. And then we have a couple of, so the FCCP, this team you've seen, we've developed a couple of questions just to get the ball rolling, maybe spark some questions in the group. So we will ask our directed questions and then open it up to your questions. A note that we will have a 5-minute break somewhere halfway through the session, just to let everyone get a needed break. And so just that's the general flow. That's what we'll do. And for you, our attendees here, to ask your questions, there are a couple of ways you can do this. There is the traditional Q&A box, the chat box, or if you are on your phone and don't have a chat box, but you can email your questions to forestc@msu.edu. So those are the kind of the traditional ways, but also with this format here, you can also raise your hand and we will call on you, right? So this is in some ways a preferred way to allow you to ask your own question and have your own kind of discussion with the panelist. So we are going to do our best here to, we already have questions from the email over the last few weeks, but we'll do our best to, handle organizing all the questions as they come through. And feel free to ask those questions, to pose those questions in the chat box, Q&A, and email at any point, right? No need to wait until an appropriate moment. You can ask them during the intros if you like to. So go ahead and post those questions whenever they come to you. And with that, let's get to our panelists today. So thank you again to the panelists for being here. Some serious brain power and experience in the room today. So in the room, so that's pretty exciting, and we're very grateful to have them. We have Grant Domke, who's a research forester with FIA. We have Ivan Fernandez with University of Maine, Ali Kosiba with assistant professor of forestry at University of Vermont, Dave MacFarlane, our own MSU, professor of forest measurements and modeling, and then also at MSU, Raju Pokharel, whose expertise is in forest resource economics. So this is our team here today, and I'm going to kind of call on each one of them to give a little bit more detail again on their particular role to play regarding forest carbon modeling and the experience that they have thereon. So let's start with Grant. Grant, if you could just, yeah, there you go.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Kylie. Thanks very much for the opportunity to participate in this panel today. I'm a research scientist, like you said. I sit in St. Paul, Minnesota, work for the USDA Forest Service Forest Inventory and Analysis Program, where I lead the carbon science group, where our primary responsibility in that group is to compile estimates of emissions and removals associated with forest land in the US, harvested wood products, urban trees and settlements, and some perennial woody vegetation in rangelands each year as part of our commitment to the United Nations. And so our research program is really in support of that reporting and really spans really from the molecule all the way up to the nation and really the globe. We're doing ecosystem ecology, physiological ecology, using inventory data, remotely sensed information, and flux tower information to improve our methods and models and the characterization of forest carbon in the US. So thanks.
Thank you. Ivan, have you up next? Yeah.
Sure. Well, I echo Grant's comments. Thank you, Kylie, for the opportunity to be on this panel. I'm a professor at the University of Maine. I'm actually not a modeler, so from the standpoint of bait and switch, I knew some of the people I know, Grant and Ali, and others that have the modeling expertise. I work with modelers, particularly Adam Dagnall and Dan Hayes here at the University of Maine, Aaron Wieskittle as well, that have been part of this project. Most of them are on sabbatical this year. So my area is biogeochemistry. I'm a soil scientist, and I've studied from a research standpoint biogeochemistry of forested ecosystems in the response to a changing air pollution and a changing climate. I'm probably can provide perspectives here as in Maine. I'm on the Maine Climate Council. It's a 39-member council charged with the development of the Climate Action Plan. I co-chair the Science and Technical Subcommittee of the council that supports the science that supports the work we do here in Maine. And on the within that, there's a natural and working lands working group that also supports the development of the Climate Action Plan. And it's within those realms that there's a tremendous amount of interest in carbon and forest carbon and how we manage it. Maine is 89% forested, so what happens with our forests, matters a lot, and there's a tremendous amount of discussion ongoing. So that's kind of the perspectives I bring.
Excellent, thank you. Ali?
Yes, hello everyone. I'm Ali Kosiba. I'm a very new professor at the University of Vermont Extension, just started last week, but I came most recently from the state of Vermont Forest, Parks and Recreation, where I was the climate forester, and I like to say proudly the first climate forester in the nation. There's other states that are now hiring on climate foresters, but really, what Ivan was touching on is really critical in Vermont, that we have a lot of effort to sort of get to the point where we can think about net zero. What does that mean? How do we manage carbon, climate change? And so there's a real need for this kind of work. I also worked with our climate council that recently, last December, we passed a climate action plan. So I was technical advisor to a group similar to what Ivan was talking about. We called it Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee, but basically the same concepts. Thinking about adaptation, resilience, and importantly, mitigation of our forests, wetlands, and agricultural systems. I did a carbon inventory for the state. It actually came first from communication purposes to talk about the importance of our forests in carbon terms. We ended up incorporating that into a state level carbon budget that included other natural and working lands. And we did really model it off the work that Maine has done. And we used a lot of, mostly grants teams work in that effort. And so that's something actually in my current job, I'm going to continue being the carbon inventory point person until someone else steps up to do it. That'll be something I'll continue working on.
Excellent, thank you. Let's see, Dave.
Okay. So as I'm a professor of forest measurements and modeling, I published my first paper on forest carbon and climate change in 1999. I've been working on that topic ever since. In the early mid-2000s, I published early estimates of potential for urban forest carbon offsets. I actually helped Michigan State register the first urban forest offset credits on the now defunct Chicago Climate Exchange. And at the time I served as a technical advisor to them on how to actually have this kind of free market approach, to carbon markets. For about 20 years, I've been working with the U.S. Forest Service, mostly in Region 9, particularly the Forest Inventory Analysis Program to improve the U.S. National Forest Carbon Inventory. I worked with Chris Woodall in improving estimates for standing dead trees. And in a multi-institutional collaboration, we developed completely new national allometric equations. Grant can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they're being launched this year. And that was based on basically a decade of multi-institutional collaborations. Aaron Weiskittle from Maine was one of my collaborators and is also a friend of mine, where we destructively sampled trees all over the US. Now I'm working on urban tree specific allometric equations using non-destructive laser scanning technology. I build models of trees and forests. I've been doing that for a long time. I also have some international experience. In 2012, as a Fulbright scholar, I helped the government of Kenya install its first forest carbon monitoring plots and write their first climate change action plan. And most recently, I've been working in the Brazilian Amazon. My colleagues and I just published a new application for estimating more accurately forest carbon stocks in the Amazon. I actually work a lot with the state of Michigan. I redesigned their entire forest inventory system recently, but surprisingly, I've never worked with the state of Michigan on forest carbon. All right, that's my list.
Okay, thank you. Raju?
Hello, everyone. My name is Raju Pokharel. I'm assistant professor of forest economics here at Michigan State University. I started here in 2020, right in the middle of the pandemic. Before that, I was in University of Idaho, and before that, I was at Mississippi State University. My core expertise lies in forest product utilization and forest, in general, forest products. I do a lot of forest sector and market models to look at what if situations we have managed activities, what if there's more utilization and where the product goes. At present, I'm looking at the harvested wood products and what would be the trade-off if that is enrolled into carbon versus if that is not enrolled into carbon. What is the trade-off of extended rotation versus afforestation, or the baseline scenarios, all kind of trade-off, economic trade-off for additional sequestrating additional carbon as well as storing carbon into harvested wood products. Mostly my work, my experience is in wood products and utilization, and I think that ties in with forest carbon because we need to store more wood, or at least use wood to displace concrete and steels and other very carbon intensive construction materials. So I'm also working with mass timber and biochar at the moment, which can be something new, maybe not very innovative, to store more carbon into soil as well as our buildings, and then help in this effort of climate change mitigation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to you all. Really, this is, to say again, an incredible collection of brain power and expertise in the space here today. So yeah, look forward to the discussion. So to start it off here with just a few questions that we've thought up here to get the ball rolling, really. First one I have is for Grant. So how do you view this, like a FIA going forward? How do you view FIA's role in state level carbon estimation and modeling going forward, sort of developments in that space? I'm wondering general developments in the urban estimations, linking with remote sensing, anything you can speak to there?
Yeah, well, I think it's an exciting time in forest carbon in general. And certainly within the FIA program and Forest Service, there's been an enormous investment in research and development in really characterizing carbon in forests, the movement of carbon between forests and other land categories, understanding and trying to attribute how carbon is changing and transferring between the atmosphere and the land sector due to disturbances, land use activities, et cetera, and those feedbacks, I guess, between the atmosphere and the land or biosphere broadly. So specifically, what sort of things are on the horizon and are we doing right now? Well, as I sort of led with, our group, really our sole being is to develop methods and models to improve the characterization of carbon in forest ecosystems. And as many of you know, I'm sure, the FIA program is really set up to provide population estimates at sort of a variety of spatial scales. One of those, and really a sort of a core population of interest within our program, is the state level. And so how can we disaggregate state level information by ownership, by forest type, by other attributes of interest to landowners, to state agencies, to nonprofits? That has been something that our team has worked specifically on, and I think FIA and the Forest Service more broadly are working on ways to better purvey that kind of information, both in sort of standardized reports. So a lot of the work that our group does is specific to this United Nations reporting, where categories are quite rigid. Key reporting categories are rigid, don't always align with how we would sort of report things, or states are interested in using things. And so we're trying to better interact with states to understand what their needs are and purvey that information in a variety of ways. So whether that be, online reports where they can quickly pull down those data, so data archives, quickly pull down those data and incorporate those in state reports and say with a straight face that those methods and models that they're using and the estimates generated for their state were a disaggregation of national greenhouse gas inventory estimates. So there's that consistency and continuity there that I think is quite valuable. Those same estimates end up in the EPA's state inventory reporting tool. So there are a variety of platforms where you can get that information. And as we work to develop new methods and models, so on the horizon, as Dave mentioned, new models for standing live and standing dead tree biomass carbon are on the horizon and will be made available in the public facing database in the months ahead. We've also developed new methods and models for litter and soil carbon. And we've been using those in national greenhouse gas reporting for 5 or 6 years and are now at a point where we're actually incorporating those into the FIA database. And so those will replace old models, and the process of doing that really allowed us to reevaluate those methods, models, and the data sources used. And what we found is that the estimates compiled as a result of this process and developing this workflow that can be internalized within FIA has really improved those estimates even further, the models themselves further. So a lot from really the individual plot all the way up to the population is happening. There's a tremendous amount of work happening in the remote sensing space. So leveraging the plot level information with auxiliary data to purvey information in new ways. So geospatial tools are being developed and data products are being developed for incorporation in reports and methods and models. So I don't want to take all the time, but I think there's a lot happening. There are some websites out there that you can kind of keep track of the latest science that is being used to sort of vet these new methods and models that will ultimately make it into the production platforms that FIA is offering. And speaking of those platforms, there's a lot of new and sort of innovative ways in which we're trying to purvey that information digitally and accessibly for a variety of people, recognizing that everyone's in a different spot in this sort of carbon journey, and we want to try and meet them wherever they're at in this space. So thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. That to answer, and I had a couple of follow-ups, but I think you've touched on them. So thank you. So next question I have is for you, Dave. When you set out to measure forest carbon or other forest characteristics, as many folks are wanting to do, maybe who haven't done so before, what's your general process for selecting a methodology, an appropriate methodology for the question at hand, the process for determining that, right? So do you have advice or lessons for folks, again, who are looking to conduct their own analyses and may not know what those first steps might be?
Yeah, I think I would say that always, look what's already been done first. So a good review of literature and using your networks, people like Grant, who's sort of, in a hub position for the federal government, probably is aware of things. So I would say if you're gonna start down a path like that, the first thing to do is make sure you're not gonna invest a lot of resources in reinventing a wheel or something like that. Once the thing to think of, I would say after that, is to pick a few methods that you think are feasible. So it's not just the quality of the method, but it's the feasibility. Your organization doesn't have the capacity to process massive amounts of remote sensing data. So even if a remote sensing based approach appears to be the best one from an accuracy perspective, you always have to sort of trade off your measurement system with the feasibility. Can my organization handle this? Now you've got down to maybe something that other people have used or sounds good and you think your organization can handle. I would say step 3 then would be to go to people who've actually used it and then ask them, what have been the successes and challenges associated with using that. And then lastly, I would say getting down to something like thinking of the scope and the scale of what you're doing. And does this make sense for, and this is sort of, we're talking a lot at the state level, but I'll give you an example. So I worked on this big team to roll out these new equations, which are going to change the national forest inventory. And as Grant said, one of the advantages is that they're more nationally consistent. But one of the things that we put into those models are ecoregion boundaries, right? So if you used old regional boundaries to create these models, you might have the same tree, if it crossed the border from, Wisconsin to Michigan, it would have a different carbon estimate. So now we try to sort of bring some more ecologically non-political boundary information in there. So I think for people operating at the state level, it's important to say, this stuff was developed at a national scope, but what do these numbers look like? What are the numbers that we're concerned with at our level? You can never get everything perfectly accurate. So there's these trade-offs between accuracy and feasibility and efficiency. And so you should figure out, where do you want to focus? Is the Michigan, for example, has a diverse land base, right? We have national forests. We have almost 4 million acres of state-owned forest, and then we have a bunch of private forests, right? So you might have to say, where do I want to focus my energy? What's the most important? Working with the state of Michigan, they're concerned when, for example, their estimates are different than the US government's, the FIA's estimates for what's happening on their forests. They have their own inventory. So I'd say, yeah, just to reiterate, do a good background check, figure out which method might work for your organization, contact people who've used that method, and then think of the context in which you're going to apply it. Do you have to tweak this method? Is it, what are you going to work on? And then for someone like me, a researcher, the next stage is, if there's nothing or there are gaps, that defines a new research project.
Well, follow there, you touched on this a little bit with the question of accuracy, right? On that being one of the many dimensions too, you have to try to optimize. So when dealing with estimates based on measured data, what process do you then use to select appropriate approach to handling uncertainty in those predictive models? Like, how do you approach uncertainty the same way and with different questions, or what process do you use to determine how you might address uncertainty?
Well, there are pretty much standard procedures for addressing uncertainty. If you look at the IPCC manual on carbon estimates, they have a whole little chapter on uncertainty. Anybody who works like I do with statistics and modeling, you can calculate things like confidence intervals, or if you work in a Bayesian realm, you can calculate credible intervals. I think what's always important for me, for an organization, is to know what your target accuracy standard is, and then what approach is going to help me to meet that target accuracy. Like the National Forest Inventory plots, the US Forest Service has standards that say we want to accurately measure the height of a tree to within plus or minus 10% of the height 90% of the time. So I tend to think from a practical, the methods are there. You don't have to reinvent uncertainty estimation, right? But you have to think about, what are your sources of uncertainty, and very important, what's our target level? What's an acceptable level of uncertainty for our organization? And then what statistical methods or approaches or measurement approaches are going to get us to hit that target? So knowing, how good does the estimate have to be?
Excellent, thank you very much for that. Now bring in the econ and harvested wood products bit a little bit, Raju. For you, where do you see the role of economic analyses fitting into forest carbon science? How do economic realities impact forest carbon science more broadly?
Just to be on the point, I think economics is going to be the central point of all this, because if we want to make things feasible, you need to look at economics, and I think that's given. If we are not generating in a free market economy, if we are not generating money, or at least at the break-even point, it would be hard to justify that this is doable. And there may be incentives, there may be some policy interventions which can do certain level of job, but economics is going to be, going to be the main driver of all of this. So when I say economics, I'm talking about the carbon carbon markets, even whatever is going into harvested wood product or any other kind of sequestration efforts that has to go through this carbon market, which is not very well developed, even though we talk about it all the time. And that's going to affect how we manage our forest and how we harvest and utilize our forest products. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. Spoken like a true economist. Economics is all that matters. So how can then harvest wood product carbon and economic analyses be used to inform policy and planning, specifically regarding the forest products sector?
Yeah, so I know we all know that there are two different thoughts of increasing the carbon sequestration in the landscape. One is like more management, less harvesting, and another is maybe we can use harvested wood products to do more sequestration efforts. And I think in both realms, economics, we can approach this from both sides. One is more management and more sequestration in the landscape through more management, or less harvesting would be would have to be through policy and incentive intervention, and we need to calculate the cost of that so that we can incentivize this kind of management activities. On the harvested wood products, if we are harvesting or if we are doing the doing more management through harvesting, then what we have to see is where the harvested wood product is going on, how long the wood product is the carbon is getting stored, and what is the harvesting catching up with the sequestration efforts. Just to give you an example, what we need to look at is if we are harvesting wood and then burning it, it has a very short half-life. And there may be a great economic drive to do that, but not a lot in the carbon sequestration efforts, and that may not qualify for the carbon credits, or you can enroll into those markets even if you are trying to do that. But whereas if certain products like mass timber or biochar, if you are going into that realm, that's going to the carbon stored in the wood is going to be stored for a very long period of time, and that can have a significant impact. So it depends on, what I want to say is, it depends on method of producing forest products, where it is going to be used and how it is going to be used. Just to give you an example, if we are producing mass timber and using it to build buildings, then it's not just the wood stored in the mass timber, it's the displacement that happens that is going to create more carbon benefits with displacing carbon and steel construction. Whereas if we are just using it for the traditional wood products, then it may not have that impact. So the methodology of trade-off depends on all these factors. It's not straight like, okay, you just calculate net present value, do benefit to cost ratio, depending on the financial analysis. That may be a straightforward approach, but I think it depends on what is going to happen to the wood. We need to take into that account to look at the economic trade-off analysis. Okay.
Great, thanks very much, Raju. Now to go toward those who've engaged in carbon modeling and some of these policy linkages. So Ali, to take it to you here, could you share any lessons that you've learned, important takeaways from engaging in Vermont's carbon quantification and modeling analysis? Now that you've done it, what do you wish you had known before going into it, or what do you want others to know before embarking on this? Pretty general.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of different lessons. One of the things, I guess, is challenging when we think about, using our carbon from our forested ecosystems or natural and working lands for state level goals is the timing of those data sets, and sort of the resolution of those data sets is very different, right? So we have carbon data, which is compiled over time from FIA plots. And then we have greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel combustion, industry, heating, all the stuff within our state. And those are really hard to sort of align temporally, and also with, talking about uncertainty. We can my understanding is we can measure those fossil fuel combustions pretty accurately, whereas we have a little bit more uncertainty. So and what at the policy levels, they sort of want to, one-to-one them. And that's a really challenging thing to do, particularly because we're often lagged with our timing of the forest carbon data by a little bit. And so, figuring out how much of this year's emissions were offset by our forests is actually a more complex question than I think a lot of policymakers would like. And so I think that's been a big challenge. And certainly, the talk about uncertainty is a little bit hard because, in Vermont and many of our states, we have a lot of variability across our state, topographically, by forest type, by landowner. And so it's really can be challenged to pick out those nuances with our, our current ways of measuring carbon with FIA data. There's just a lot of we don't sort of get that real-time change that might happen from a disturbance event, from changes in markets that might influence different harvesting patterns over others, and particularly from land use decisions. I mean, that's a big thing that we're working with is the, land use conversion and losses of carbon from that. And not only that, you lose that future sequestration potential. So, I don't know if I have a ton of lessons. I'm sort of been going through this, blindly a little bit, trying to figure out as I go along. And then, but really it's just a starting point for us as a state and figuring out how we can improve our, our understanding of our carbon and sort of communicating that to folks that are making the policy. So I think it's been like a really good learning opportunity for everyone to, there's certainly been an increased understanding and value in our forests here in Vermont, because now people are interested in it for the mitigation potential, which is really great if you're like me, a forest ecologist, that people are finally really appreciating forests for what they're worth. So, but I'd say that we just have a lot to go, and it's challenging. I would say for Vermont, we're small. We don't have a lot of folks. I'm sort of doing this and not alone. I'm definitely not doing alone, but there aren't, I don't have a lot of other, I don't have a team of people. And so I think that's hard when each of our states are sort of forging ahead. And I've certainly learned from Maine and some other states. Massachusetts has done a bunch of this work as well. But we have, I think these conversations where we can share information and sort of learn from each other is really critical. Because it's, it doesn't make sense for Vermont to do something very different from New Hampshire next to us or New York. And the other thing I'll say that's been a challenge is the state boundary issue, like what occurs within our state versus out of state. And that's been a really, the greenhouse gas emissions are really in-state accounting. And so that's what I did for our forest carbon inventory. But that's a real challenge because if we didn't, I included harvested wood products. There was analysis done by some Forest Service folks. But if that includes only wood harvested in our state. And so we, Vermont imports more than, we export. And so how do we account for those changes? How do we account for sort of our effects elsewhere? And so that's something that I haven't wrapped my head around. I don't think we have as a state sort of figured out how to, rectify that. And I'm sure most other states are thinking about that too.
Thank you. To that question of, is the state the appropriate boundary, the appropriate unit? So Vermont is also involved in the Securing Northeast Forest Carbon Program, right? So question, which is a regional initiative, right? So how did that come together? What are the benefits, constraints of some of that interstate cooperative effort?
Yeah, so that came about, I think Charlie Levesque is on this call. So he was the principal investigator of that grant that was funded through the Forest Service Northeast Midwest Landscape Scale Restoration Grant. A lot of what we've been doing so far is like science communication. And that has been a big part of my role. What is forest carbon? How does it move through a forest? How are the different pools influenced by different factors? What are some ways we can think about managing, certainly educating folks on carbon offset markets? That's a really complex and new field that most of us do not understand very well. And then we have to talk to landowners a lot and navigate that. And so then there's a big part, we haven't sort of got into this in the securing Northeast forest carbon work, but actually sort of quantifying the efforts that folks have been doing on the ground. Are folks managing for forest carbon? Are they enrolling in markets? Can we sort of keep track of that as a region? Because it is sort of hard to navigate. I do this in Vermont. How many acres of Vermont forest land are enrolled in an offset project? I don't know that answer. It's hard to get that because it comes from different organizations, but it is critical if we think about, Vermont's goal for 2050 is to be carbon neutral. So to mitigate greenhouse gases from forest sequestration and other natural ecosystems. But as private landowners sell their carbon to other entities through these offset markets, we lose that ability as a state. And that doesn't mean that's wrong or bad, but it's just something we need to be aware of and have a sort of a plan of what we're going to do, because we could eventually get to a point where, half of our 4.5 million acres of forest that carbon's already been sold elsewhere, accounted for.
Excellent. Thank you, Ali. So Ivan, I want to take it to you here and some questions about this sort of linking with policy and state goals, right? So you, as you noted, you were co-chair of the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee of Maine's Climate Action Group and also a member of the Natural and Working Lands Group. So what role did carbon modeling play in informing those conversations? What role could it have played? If it wasn't present? Could it have helped inform some of that discussion and decision making? Do you have any important lessons learned or takeaways from that experience?
Sure. So I think a lot of important points have already been raised, and I'm certainly not the one to expand further on them. And Ali's talking about some of Vermont's experiences, which are I think quite parallel to what Maine and other states are doing. I guess I would start by, I think we're living through a unique period of time. I mean, we all are aware of the global science of climate change, the urgency of bending the curve on emissions by 2030, cutting emissions in half to meet targets. So I think we're in a period now that contrasts with where we've been in recent decades as the modern technologies of modeling and measurement have developed, in that we're sort of in an era of flying the plane and building it at the same time, for an overworn metaphor. But we're making policy decisions with some level of urgency, and we're also probably more concerned than ever before that we get it right, in the sense of what matters from a climate standpoint. We wouldn't be talking about carbon this much if it didn't have to do with climate change, and that linkage to climate change is what the atmosphere sees. And so it's really important that, I think, as we sit around, and I say we, I'm one of the two scientists on the 39-member Climate Council, right? So when they looked up for more interpretation from the scientists in the midst of the policy discussion, it's trying to convey the issues of what's the state of our technology to measure, what's the state of our technology, therefore, to model. How does that apply to the different kinds of forested landscapes, small woodland owners, industrial forests, national forests? That's a lot of ground to cover. And yet the policies are not going to wait for another 20 years for the science to develop. So I think one of the lessons has been to try and cut through to what are the key goals and what's the time frame, and then how do we convey around the modeling products what assumptions go into them, so that those that are not modelers and forest scientists can think about it in their context, and what's the uncertainty. And it's, the experts on this panel deal with it every day, but how do we convey that uncertainty in a meaningful way to help decision makers, policymakers, and managers make those kinds of decisions. So probably, you know, one of the lessons has been to think about those key points of translation in helping to formulate policy and recognizing the urgency with which that's taking place. In Maine, you know, Adam Dagna and others, but he's been leading the modeling around, much like Raju was mentioning, the natural climate solutions. What are the different alternative management approaches? How does economics play into the efficacy of different approaches? And having that kind of information available as output for Maine's landscape, Maine's markets, Maine's products, for the decision makers, and then backing off and putting that in the context of that information is utilized, I'm going to overstate it, but quite differently when we're talking about policies that might incentivize small woodland owners, because their priorities for how they're going to manage their land might be quite different. And, you know, sort of the big bar of carbon sequestration from biochar or from some other silvicultural management is not what's going to sway their decision. An industrial forest landowner, obviously, it could be, and it often is, quite different. And so it's not one size fits all. It's trying to provide a framework for decision makers to take the modeling output, understand it and its uncertainty, and then put it in the framework for their decision making.
Thank you all for this initial these initial questions here. I would propose now, why don't we take our 5-minute break now, let folks kind of digest some things and you know, think about the questions, and we'll maybe meet back up at, what does that have, at 3:23. We'll pop back into the space with some more questions. That sound all right? Good. Okay, we'll see everybody soon. Thank you so far. Just wait a second for Grant. There we are. All right, awesome. Welcome back, everybody. Hope we've all had our necessary stretching. So I think we'll jump to some of our collected and real-time posed questions. Chad, you have one to start us off here.
Yeah, I think this may be as a question best for Grant or Dave, but any panelists please chime in. So the question is, what are recommendations or guidance for how to handle comparisons of the various potential fates for forest industry and forest management residues? For instance, comparing the use of residues for energy or products as compared to other fates such as open pile burning or just decomposing material.
Yeah, I think that could go several different directions in terms of panelists. Raju might actually be the best suited to deal with that. I can just start and say that time is of the essence here. Time is a really important factor when we think about the material and how it's utilized, and what the alternative fates of residues versus round wood might be. So, you know, so the way that we treat them in the greenhouse gas inventory, and the way that in the eyes of sort of IPCC right now, any biomass for energy is treated as instant oxidation. Essentially, if it's removed, it's lost in the year of the removal. And so that's how we treat residues. That's how we treat any sort of material that's currently used in terms of international reporting. Now, how is that committed? So in the US, we use what's called the production approach. And so there were some questions, and I think it was maybe Ali that brought it up earlier wisely, about state level harvested wood products and emissions associated with state level products. So in the US, for greenhouse gas emissions removals, anything that's exported, we still report on the emissions associated with that. So that includes biomass for energy. And the same would be true for states using the production approach. So if Vermont's a major importer of wood from other states, depending upon the approach used to characterize the emissions pathway associated with that harvested wood product, it can really matter, and there can be some misaccounting, there can be gaps, there can be omissions, there can be double counting. And so I'm going to stop there in terms of the sort of the biology of it, but I would just say that time is a really important factor in considering the material, the residue, the size of the residue, whether it's left in the forest versus burned abruptly. Generally, that time piece is quite important in terms of thinking about when it becomes an emission, or at least when we report that it becomes an emission. I'll pass it to the others on the panel.
So yeah, I would chime in here. Yeah. So yeah, as Grant said, yeah, everything is reported as of now when it is harvested, or it is reported as residues, as emissions. But that should not. I agree that should not be the case. Should be. I want to go back to what I said earlier, like how it is going to be utilized. If we are burning it right away, obviously that's emission, but what are we using it to burn it for? If we are burning it instead of fossil fuels, then even if it's an emission, it's displacing some fossil fuels, and that should be accounted for. And it should be accounted in these emission calculations. Whereas if we are just pile burning it, then obviously it's a source of emissions, and also and a careful evaluation has to be done how we are utilizing these residues to see either it is an emitter or actually it is helping sequester some carbon, or at least displacing some of the fossil fuels. So my point here is residues are not always a source of not always it can be emitter as well as it can be it can help in sequestration efforts, both. So we have to do a careful evaluation, and as a modelers or economic people like us who does that have to look at where these things end up to see what happens, and are they going to emit more, or are they going to help reduce the carbon dioxide emissions? Thank you.
Okay, so a question here for anybody who's engaged, anybody who's been engaged in aspects of carbon modeling, and especially kind of linking those to policy questions. What are the important things to consider when crafting policy to ensure consideration and inclusion of social equity issues? So how does carbon modeling inform conversations there? Does carbon science play a role in informing climate justice? Have these been really, for those of you who've been involved in state level decision-making conversations, how have those two concepts been linked, or could they be linked?
I'll chime in. I think we're learning as we go how to do that better. First of all, I think one of the places where that emerges, maybe less in the carbon issue than in others, but certainly there is kind of the quality of data and where the data come from that are used as a basis for validating models and parameterizing models, et cetera. And do they map onto the communities that are going to be impacted or incentivized by policies? And so, I think it's important for us to think about where the data are coming from, the kind of monitoring programs that are needed to support the modeling, and then what the modeling is geared for, particularly when it's linked to economic modeling that drives programs that incentivize. Who are we incentivizing, and are we coming up with solutions and products that address all communities equitably? And I think that's a really important arena. I think all the states are wrestling with that, or other entities that are involved in this. But I think we're in an era of learning as we go as well.
I guess I can chime in following Ivan. Certainly what he talked about, similar. And then I would also say sort of on the flip side, I sort of touched on it before, but the impacts here versus away. So those are two, that gets into, economic justice and equity issues. So example of leakage, right? If we are looking to increase our forest carbon stocks in Vermont at the expense of harvesting wood products, what does that mean for where those wood products are coming from if demand is not addressed, right? If we're not talking about how to reuse wood products in a better way or have more sustainability in the use. And so there's a potential for that leakage to really impact places where they may not have the resources to be managing for forest carbon and all sorts of other, environmental and human, justice issues. And the other thing I wanted to talk that reminded me of is also similarly here versus away. This brought up discussions of emissions from biomass combustion. There's certainly carbon dioxide, but also many other things, particulates that are produced. But then we forget when we're accounting, this is like the state level of counting, if we're counting that here and we don't account for those impacts when we import fossil fuels, or even this came up in the Climate Council, we get a lot of our energy from Hydro-Quebec. And there are some land use equity issues there with Indigenous communities. There's also a lot of other greenhouse gases that are emitted from the damming of the water. So it just brought up into these other, how do we account when we're accounting for in-state carbon? How do we account for our demands from other places where we might not see those impacts quite so clearly? So we didn't really resolve that, but it brought up a lot of interesting discussions. And we do have an equity committee as part of our climate action plan to sort of be, considering those issues.
Great, thank you, Tuba. There are kind of two follow-up questions that that link with what you're saying there. One, to what you were just saying, Ali, is so when you're deciding to do a carbon analysis, how do you appropriately choose the study area and the extent of analysis? Sort of similar to what you're saying, like generally land use change and forest activities are counted, but how do you decide what else counts as the forest sector, right? If we're not going to count trucking, for instance, as part of forest sector emissions. So how are those decisions made if you're going to do the analysis? What makes the cut and what doesn't?
Well, I'll say transportation was already accounted for in our fossil fuel. So our state level greenhouse gas accounting already counted for any purchase of fossil fuels within our state. So you could lose trucking. Some of our wood that's harvested here, quite a lot, goes up to Quebec. So you could have a situation where the logging truck refuels right across the border and that wouldn't be counted. But so for the most part, we would be accounting for trucking, equipment use, processing within our state. But really, I was sort of limited by, what data exists, right? And a lot of the data is at state level. And we have, I will say, harvested wood products, and Grant can probably talk more about this, but we, in a rural state like Vermont, we actually don't know exactly how much wood is harvested. We do get mill reports. So our mills in our state will voluntarily report to Forest Parks and Recreation, and have had a really good long relationship. And so we trust those data, but we have a lot of small timber operators, small sawmills, certainly firewood processors. We can't really get all of that. And so it's really hard for us to really know about the harvested wood products. And then when we get to imports versus exports, and not only from saw log material, right, and the raw material, but going and buying furniture from, and bringing it in state that wood came from elsewhere, it's really hard for us to sort of track and understand that.
Yeah, I would just point out that we're also in an era now where states are our traditional emissions inventory, as Grant mentioned, we use the SITS tool, and then states will modify with local information where we have better information on the emissions side. But what goes on beyond the borders is increasingly important, and as we do this, and particularly as we have conversations among multiple states, regions, and of course beyond. And that's the contrast between consumption inventories versus emission inventories. I think we're just beginning to try and map out how that's done and how we accommodate carbon emissions from the forestry sector in that regard. The other challenge, I think, with the forestry sector is how and others can speak to this, but how we address trees in urban areas and suburban areas and wetlands, and in some cases, depending on how it's approached, in agriculture. A lot of the land owned by the farmer is actually forested, with a minor portion of the area in cropland, and different systems will address that differently. And so those are important challenges in coming up with, as Ali worked on, a state level kind of budget.
A little bit of a follow-up question here is, for our panelists, where do you see the role of like a state forest agency in educating the public, as well as specifically landowners, one around kind of carbon science, but also like a broader understanding of not just carbon science, but how that relates to like the forest industry as a whole and like larger greenhouse gas emission accounting?
I guess I can do that as the previous only person. I would be state agency person. Well, I will say extension too. You know, a lot of our states have extension offices, and then nonprofits have been really good in sort of working on disseminating information. So I do think it's critical. Most, you know, foresters, land managers this wasn't part of their education, you know, so getting us all up to speed. And plus you know, things are changing quickly. We're learning new things all the time, right? The capacity of soils to store carbon. We're learning a lot about that pretty much every day. So I do think there's a huge role there. And particularly that interface with landowners. I think, you know, my experience, I do work a lot with landowners. I also work a lot with foresters who work with landowners. And I think landowners are really eager to do something for, you know, climate change, and they hear a lot about carbon, and so they really want to do something. But, you know, it can conveying to them how nuanced it is, how dynamic, you know, it's important for folks to know that it's not sort of a black and white issue, that there's a lot of variation in there and a lot of things that affect carbon. I think the tendency is to think it gets locked in the forest and then it's there forever, which we all know is not true. So yeah, and I will say, just harkening back to the Northeast or securing Northeast Forest Carbon Program, that sort of was the goal of it, to bring together the seven states, so New England and New York, together, sort of get together. We have a point person in each state, or more than one even, to sort of, disseminate information. And we have a clearinghouse online to get some information out. But you know, there's certainly the Forest FCCP that's doing that. There's a lot of different groups, I think, getting the word out on forest carbon science and dynamics.
And then kind of one more follow-up for the academic crowd who's more in the role of training professionals in this space. What do you all kind of think are some of the skills and training necessary, and how can we be better about bolstering those skills in our kind of like recruiting our next workforce in this like forest carbon science space?
Well, I guess I'm an academic, so I'll chime in here, but others obviously can as well. I probably would argue that and realize I've been doing what I do for a very long time. So, you know, one of these old professors that is going to say, boy, you've got to get people out in the woods. You've got to get them hands-on experience. We have a lot of wonderful technology, including the modeling that we're talking about here today. But I think building opportunities for students to be involved in the kind of programs that we're all aware of or contributing to around carbon forest management, that incorporates kind of being in the woods and actually seeing how forests operate, and how the data from what they do in the woods translates to the kind of modeling and inventory work that is driving these decisions, I think is really critical, and investing in those kinds of opportunities is only more important. Plus, it provides the skill sets for when they walk out the door to be able to be of greater value to their employers, whether it's or in the state or private sector.
And another question here, maybe especially for Dave and Grant. Could you speak to the pros and cons of spatially explicit versus non-spatially explicit approaches to both quantifying forest carbon and projecting forest carbon? Certain modeling frameworks might apply one approach versus the other. How are we supposed to make sense of that? And what we should be doing?
Yeah, well, it's a good question, and one where I think it's even there's more nuance to it maybe than even the person that asked it might think, in terms of, we think of the FIA data as spatially explicit. We know where on the ground that point is, and we're characterizing carbon there, so it's spatially explicit from that perspective. But those data then are not spatially continuous, so we don't have spatially continuous and spatially explicit information together, which is why we leverage these auxiliary data sources to maybe move from that spatially explicit point and compile population estimates and characterizations, maps, if you will, these sort of intermediate products to sort of portray whatever your attribute of interest might be on the landscape. I would say that both are really important and have their place. And just to sort of bundle up a whole bunch of things that I might have commented on based on these recent questions, I think place matters. While we're talking about state level here, I think increasingly as we labor over building new and better methods and models, we also need better information on practice. Who's doing what? What are the incentives out there that we can then attribute back to those great methods and models we're developing and the changes on the landscape? What are those drivers at that place base? And that's where I think spatially explicit and continuous information is really critical to understand patterns of parcelization that are being sort of pushed thanks to policies, incentive programs, etc. And so I absolutely think there's a place for both. From my perspective, whether it's the entity, so a small scale, maybe a municipality, even a private land holding, ultimately that map is this intermediate product portraying something. Underneath that, though, is the population parameter of interest. It's the estimate of carbon per unit area or total carbon with uncertainty that we're interested in, and potentially how that carbon has changed as a result of some perturbation, natural or anthropogenic. And so while the map helps our eyes sort of identify those changes and patterns of change, it's the underlying estimates that I think are still really foundational to reporting, are essential for reporting. So I don't think it's an either or. I think it's really somewhat scale sensitive in terms of what you're trying to do, what the drivers are, what the question at hand is. If carbon has changed in your state, why is it changing? Is that something? Well, I think broadly we can probably capture that in a table with spatially explicit estimates used to generate population estimates from FIA. But if we're interested in parcelization and how parcelization might be changing or altering carbon stocks or transfers, having a map is really helpful to see how those patterns lay out on the landscape. The same could be said for all sorts of other patterns and processes related to forest carbon. I'll stop there and pass it to Dave.
All right, well, I think you captured the essence of it. I mean, to me, in general, I would say that spatially explicit data are better in the context of many of the questions and problems people are trying to answer. One of the things, as I've studied this problem as a researcher over the years, is the recognition that that the numbers change as you change your window. And I'll give you an example. I was working on RED, reduced emission from deforestation. And so there was incentives associated with deforestation rates. And so if you looked at a particular spot and you calculated what the deforestation rate was in an area, and then you just make that window just a little bit bigger, it changes, and then it changes again. And a lot of times in my career, I've tried to look at quantify things more as continuum rather than putting them into map categories. Like, for example, I was saying in the new equations that we're using, we didn't want, when you plotted a national carbon map, we didn't want the carbon to abruptly change at a state boundary. So we used ecoregions. Well, ecoregions are also, discrete shapes. And so if you calculate a value within an ecoregion, it's just another type of a boundary. So I think if we could move towards more continuous spatial modeling, that would be ideal. And I think because of the advances in remote sensing technology at the global scale, LiDAR, all of these other things, we're moving towards a point where we can create a continuous field. And let me just describe this very clearly. Let's imagine you could have a continuous field of carbon, right? Where at every tiny little pixel was assigned a carbon value. Then you could take your Vermont state boundary as a cookie cutter and slice into that. You would get a different answer than if you pre-sliced, the boundary and then created an inventory that was sort of discrete within that. And the more edge there is, the more variation in types, the more discontinuities there are, the more that number's going to change. So I would say what we should try for as much as possible are continuous spatial processes. Another, just to point to the National Forest Inventory data, those of us who work with it or want to do spatial modeling with it, many people may or may not be aware that the Forest Service does something called fuzzing and swapping, right? And so fuzzing is basically to protect the identity, of the forest inventory plot. They blur the coordinates. So then you've created like an uncertainty around location, which could spill over into the next county, the next census district, the next ecoregion. And then they also do swapping, which means either to further make it harder to identify. If you have a large landowner or something like that, who, even if you fuzz, you can still tell, oh, this was on Weyerhaeuser's land or something like that. They swap the coordinates. So, and totally understand why the US FIA does that. There's important reasons why they do that. But this whole idea of being able to map things does also, getting back to what people were talking about before, it also brings up social equity issues, right? Because if you had a perfect map, then you would basically know, you'd be in everyone's backyard, oh, this company's doing this. And so, getting into the judgment side of it, the non-spatially explicit data can sometimes be more, what I want to say, it respects privacy and things like that. So I say from a quantitative statistical ideal measurement system, I would say a continuous spatial field would be best. But if you want to bring in some of these other factors, social boundaries and privacy and things like that, non-spatial information does have value too.
Thank you. Grant, do you have something you wanted to add there?
Yeah, I want to be sensitive to time, but I would just add one really quickly. We make maps all the time. We're always looking at trying to portray carbon in finer and finer spatial scales. And I think resolution matters. The scale at which we're operating matters. We can create a map of carbon in the United States, but what is the estimation? What is the operational unit of that map that we're interested in? And so I think we can think about that along Dave's continuum and think about, hey, right now FIA plots represent 2,400 hectares. That's essentially your estimation unit for that individual plot. Maybe it's a pixel, maybe it's 30 meters. So I think that's something, for resource managers, for planners, et cetera, thinking about what the operational scale of interest is really important as you start to think about land changes and all the other considerations, features that you want to portray within that estimation unit. And you might find, we've written papers on this, that, well, it might seem ideal to use that sentinel pixel that's 10 meters and that we can get every 8 days. The reality is 1,000-meter pixel is more than adequate, and the uncertainty is a lot smaller. It's a lot less computationally expensive. And at the resolution that we're looking at, the state, the estimate, whatever the resolution, maybe it's still providing more than enough detail for whatever the objective might be.
Yeah, that's a great point. And going back to the earlier question was asked about uncertainty, I think the point Grant made about uncertainty is an incredibly important one. Just the idea that what is, if you have a spatial estimate, we think of that map has like an exact value on it, but it doesn't. It's like almost a circle of noise around it, or a range of values, even though you've assigned that, a distribution of values. Yep.
Okay. Well, thank you for this important conversation here. I think we have time for one last question, or we'll see what we do. We'll try with this, maybe our last question. For all of you who have either engaged in carbon modeling or carbon estimation at any scale, any interesting or unexpected findings, anything you've discovered that might be unexpected, as said, or politically or economically not what you were hoping for, not what the funders were hoping for, not what you were hoping to find, or anything, those who've been engaged in urban carbon estimation, any interesting findings that were unexpected in that space. That question is really to all of you. To any of you, share away.
I guess I'll start. I'll kick things off. I think a couple of things. So I'm not a soil scientist. Ivan can jump in here. He's probably worked in this space. But in recent years, we've been doing a lot with litter and soil, and thinking about the sort of static inventories that exist in the United States now, and what a great position we think that we're in terms of characterizing stocks. But there's still a dearth of information on change and perhaps the largest terrestrial carbon pool on Earth, the soil. And what we're learning, I think every day there's a new paper, and Ali sort of alluded to this, around the role of microbes and below ground biota in the processing of everything, and the interconnections and relationships between what happens below ground with what's happening above ground. And thinking more about how we can use inventories. And I'll just throw a little pitch, selfless promotion here, that we're actually in the process right now of reprocessing all of the FIA soil samples to get DNA analysis of what the heck was living in those soils, to sort of build this sort of dynamic component to our inventory, to sort of understand productivity, nutrient cycling. And so that's been sort of a remarkable sort of eye-opening process for me in working in this space, is the importance of something that only in the last decade or so we've really started to pay attention to, and are still looking for ways to monitor and characterize what's happening below ground. I don't think we've even scratched the surface on just how important soil microbes are in global nutrient cycling. So.
Yeah, I'd reiterate that. Actually, Lauren Cooper, who's on this call, and I worked with a scientist in Ecuador, and this was in agroforestry systems. And one of the really interesting results we had was it was comparing teak plantations to these agroforestry systems that were more diverse. And we showed that the teak, the plantation systems, they can sequester more above ground, but the below ground sequestration was actually higher under this more diverse system that had slower growing and more diverse trees. And one of the main explanations for that is actually the arthropod microbial sort of diversity in those soils that you feeding all sorts of different nutrients, so you increase the soil biodiversity, and so that there's more organisms operating and sequestering carbon. So a similar result that it's not just the soil stored, but it's thinking of the soil as how alive is it and how biodiverse the soil is, which isn't something that we've talked a lot about in the past.
I'm just going to chime in. I think those are all wonderful statements. I totally support that importance. I think in all seriousness, the soil component of this, because it's such a large pool, is incredibly important, and we don't really even have common concepts of how deep you go for the soil. So how deep do you define it? Different systems go to different depths. And depth matters. Small amounts of change in a large mass of deeper soil is a big change. And so, yeah, these are really important topics.
So
One more thing on that is, oh, go ahead, Raju. Go ahead.
So from the economic prospect, just to add on, is one of the challenge we have is the data, economic data available with these things there, because the prices are all over the place. Because that can make a significant difference on whether a landowner would just enroll into program or not. And then another thing is there are not a lot of markets. Even if we say that there's market, there's just one regulatory market in US and then maybe 3 or 4 voluntary markets. So that's and it's a real challenge, and it's a project by project basis. Also, all the activities, all the verification process, and all the payments are based on this project by project basis. The same kind of management, same kind of activity in project may get paid $5 per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, whereas in another project it may get paid $25 per ton. So there's that big disparity in economic data and pricing and all of that, which somehow we have to standardize some of that process if we really want to just develop a coherent and good carbon markets. Thank you.
Thanks, Raju. That's a nice reminder to note that we did not get to all of our questions we were hoping to ask today, notably one on voluntary markets and the role that plays there. But in any case, we did get to ask a lot of interesting questions. I want to thank all of you so much for being here, both the attendees and especially our panelists here. So Ivan, Ali, Grant, Raju, Dave, it's been really, really enlightening and interesting and all the things. So really, really appreciate your long stretch of time that you've dedicated to this year. And so thank you to all. We will close it there.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, all.